Let me welcome right to the show Karna Small Bodman. Karna, how are you?
Well, I'm terrific, Jim. So glad to be with you today.
You know, Karna, you're from the same line of work, and Valerie, who just answered the phone, and I were TV anchors, and we got married to each other. So we've kind of been in
Oh,
the same line of work. So for some reason, this always happens. I set up a lot of guests. I've butchered two things now with Karna. With first I got the day wrong in the emails and messed up the emails, and then I called her 10 minutes late. And luckily, I know that in your line of work, you understand such things. But what a resume! So you started on the West Coast, and you did the reporter thing, you did the anchor thing, and then you got into the White House with Reagan and all that. I mean, how fascinating!
it was. I tell you, Jim. I spent 6 years with President Reagan, and what an absolutely wonderful man. My first job, as you might have, I think you mentioned in your previous hour, I was listening on your website.
Uh-oh.
I was deputy press secretary, deputy to Jim Brady, and then my last job, worked up, was senior director and spokesman for the National Security Council. So you have an opportunity to go to, arms control talks with the Soviets and, summit meetings with Gorbachev and events like that. But it really was a terrific, terrific 6 years.
Well, you know what I got to ask you, Karna. I mean, you report on the news, report on the news, report on the news. Then you're sitting there with the Gorbachevs, and this was back in the days when it was contentious. Was the reality of how we run our world anything like what you thought as a journalist?
No, not really. Not completely. But as I say, it was it was hard because so much goes on, obviously, inside the White House, and so much goes on once you are briefed about things. You have you have a top secret clearance and all that sort of thing, and a lot of things you absolutely cannot talk about, of course. And so, unfortunately, I think what people read in the paper really isn't always, what is actually going on. However, having said that, we now look back, and there are some wonderful books, wonderful articles coming out about Reagan. The latest one called The Notes, where he has all of his little sayings and things in there that were really terrific. One that I loved, Reagan used to say, there are 3 stages of life: youth, middle age, and you look terrific.
Yeah. Which means you look terrific because you're alive, right?
Well, that's right. And of course, we all remember, oh my gosh, you probably even remember where you were. The date was March 30th, about 9 weeks into the first administration. And that was the day that I was scheduled to be in the car with Jim Brady on March 30th on the way to the Hilton Hotel for a speech to that union group. Well, I didn't go at the very last minute. Stayed back at the White House to handle some press calls and things. And, of course, that was the moment when they walked out of that meeting that John Hinckley fired 6 shots in 3 seconds combat style using a devastation bullet he thought might, explode inside the victim. I mean, it was incredible. Now, the only reason it didn't explode was he was using a smaller gun, a .22.
Unbelievable,
And,
Karna.
there's a brand new book out, I know you talk about books, called Rawhide Down, which is all about that assassination attempt.
Yeah, he was scheduled for yesterday, and we have him on next week, but that'll be interesting.
Yeah, it's a terrific book, and I just finished reading it. Brought back a lot of memories because, as I said, I wasn't there, but I spent the day in the Situation Room along with members of the cabinet and others as they carried on the day and got Bush back, the vice president, to take over and so forth. But we all probably remember that even in the midst of that crisis situation, Reagan was able to maintain a sense of humor. I mean, we remember some of the lines. He's being wheeled into the operating room, and he looks up at the doctors from the gurney, and he says, "I hope you're all Republicans."
Mm-hmm. I mean, he was saying that he didn't even know he got shot at the time. How macho is that?
Well, at the time when Jerry Parr, the Secret Service agent, threw him into the car and covered him, he thought maybe Jerry had cracked a rib or something. That was the first. And you see, one of the problems when he first arrived at the hospital, as I understand it, is that the bullet that actually hit the president hit the car first, and it sort of skittered along the edge, and in that trajectory it tended to kind of flatten out a little bit. So when it hit the president, it went in more like a thin dime. It didn't make a round bullet hole, you see. So then they had to quickly examine everything. I mean, later they figured out with x-rays that, yeah, it was a bullet. But still, it was kind of dicey at first. They didn't quite see it. And later, what we discovered, but we never really announced to the nation at that time, do you know, Jim, that bullet was lodged 1 inch from his heart.
Wow.
Unbelievable.
Karna, let me ask you about politics, because everybody thinks that folks like you who were anchors in California are very liberal. And here you are in the Reagan White House. I mean, how much is real about the characterization of bias in the media, and how did you go from the media, which, you know, I've done it my whole life too, is kind of a liberal organization no matter where you are, and in the Reagan, Mr. Conservative White House? That must have been different.
Well, I tell you, I probably was the kind of a token conservative in the KGO newsroom in San Francisco. Really, there was one other guy that I could sort of talk to. He was a cameraman who had an American flag on the dashboard of his car.
Wow.
I was kind of outnumbered by all the kids from the free speech movement out of Berkeley. But then what actually happened was I was anchoring the news. I went out there out of college. I was anchoring the news there in the late 70s when Reagan was governor. And I got to know his people. They were guests on my show. I interviewed Reagan several times. So then when he did get to the White House, I was already in Washington doing another show here. And I got a call from Jim Baker because they remembered me and figured at least I was fair, and they were looking for people to go in, and then discovered I really was a Reagan supporter, although I had not worked on the campaign.
Wow, that is fantastic. All right, one question, then I want to ask you about your books. But the last question is, I always tell people that, not that I don't believe what comes out of the White House, but basically every newsroom I ever ran, I ran a bunch of middle market newsrooms and things like that, and everything. I mean, every meeting I was ever in my whole career ended with, okay, now what do we tell the people? So I assume, I think with some knowledge behind it, that when we see a president meet a world leader and they shake hands and hug outside, when they go in, for 5 minutes, they actually really talk, and we don't ever really get to hear that. You did get to hear that. How interesting is that?
Well, extremely interesting, and yeah, you're right, because every administration tries to put their own spin on things and, make get as decent coverage as they can. But even so, the press doesn't always report it because the press is looking for something. Titillating, gigantic, whatever. The old line used to be, if it bleeds, it leads. We know that. And it's tough. I remember there was a sign up in one of the newsrooms I worked in, and it said, only you can prevent talking heads. So, they wanted action, that sort of thing. So it is kind of tough because if, they didn't want 20 or 30 seconds of someone explaining complicated policy. They're afraid they're going to lose viewers that way. But thank God now we've got the internet, we've got blogs, we have so many ways to get information, and it's really terrific because we can be much better informed than we were in those days. Well,
I want to make sure everybody goes to karnasmallbodman.com and sees what I see, because you got all these books. Now, this is not easy. You've had some difficult jobs in your time. I bet your writing is one of the toughest. You have a heroine in your books, and obviously you use the knowledge that you've gleaned from your real-life position to do this. But you take on some crazy deep, stealing missile secrets and stuff like that. I mean, how did you get into this?
Well, of course, as I said, my last job, I spent a couple of years on the National Security Council staff. And so all of my books, there's 3 of them out there now, Checkmate, Gambit, and the latest one, Final Finesse. Each one deals with a different threat to our national security that I see as real threats. And as a matter of fact, Jim, certain aspects of every single one of those books now is coming true. It's kind of freaking me out. The first book actually was inspired by Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, missile defense, that sort of thing. And I was fascinated with the whole idea back then. Reagan was so in favor of this thought, and so I wanted to create a story about it. So I did. I created a character who works for a defense contractor, and she invents a breakthrough technology for defense against cruise missiles. And we'll get the story away. Bad guys trying to steal it, and then in the second, and the bad guys are not all Al Qaeda. That's boring. Everybody writes that. This is different countries doing different things. Then the second book, Gambit, we bring back the same heroine, working on yet another problem where some bad guys are beginning to take down some of our airliners with shoulder-fired missiles. Now, that's not a stretch.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my gosh, there are almost a million of those things floating around the world. They make them all over the place. So very well could happen. And then the third book, Final Finesse, the latest one, a couple of different heroes and heroines in that one. That one, the girl works on the White House staff, and she gets very concerned when some shadowy group, don't know who it is slipping across the Mexican border, easy to do, and begins to sabotage some of our energy supplies, blowing up pipelines and so forth. And her superiors at the White House just figure, oh, come on, it's probably a maintenance issue, it's a gas company problem, we got other things we're much more concerned about. But she hooks up with a guy who works for the oil and gas company, and you got a little love interest going here, of course, in the book. Now, let me ask you a question, Jim. When was the last time you read a novel or went to the movies and the hero worked for an oil and gas company?
I have a confession to make since you said that. When I prepped for the interview and I saw that, my natural instinct was to say, this guy, who apparently I can read between the lines, had slept with this woman or whatever, this guy is going to end up being a bad guy at the end. That's what was just my guess, because I couldn't imagine the public accepting this guy as the hero. But so there you have
He's a hero.
it.
I like to be a little bit different. It's funny. I do try to weave in a lot of my experiences, of course, in the White House, because you've got very scenes right there. This is a scene in the Situation Room, scenes in the Oval Office, scenes in the Roosevelt Room, and so forth, around town and on Capitol Hill. And in fact, when one of my books, I lucked out, was featured on the Today Show, they said, instead of calling these books fiction, maybe we should call them faction. And I thought that was kind of a neat line.
Well, it seems like that's the future. I mean, you're going to be the next person if you haven't already. I know we had Brad Meltzer on. He was talking about is it the Red Cell Project, where Homeland Security talks to authors and people like that. I mean, you're one of those people again. But I want to ask you something from journalist to journalist. How did you go from, I'm going to be blunt about this, writing copy as quickly as you could under the deadline of TV news, where no one can get too creative because you're banging it out. Then you get into what I consider to be a dry yet exciting line of work, like National Security Council, things like that. How are you writing exciting dialogue, and where did you get the training for that?
I get that question a lot on book tours, as I go around and give talks and so forth. And I'm not exactly sure how the transition was made, because I do know that in the earlier days there was a premium on brevity, as you say.
Mm-hmm.
Write a 20-second live or write a one-page summary about what we're doing in the Middle East today or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then you go to trying to write a novel, and you get about to the page 220. Oh my God, where do I go from here? I love to write dialogue. I'm in love with the English language. I listen to people. In fact, whenever I'm out with anyone, out to dinner, out to a party, and I hear someone say something sort of clever or use an interesting word, I jot it down. And I tell them, I give an acknowledgement. And I say, be careful what you say. It's going to end up in my next novel. I do that all the time.
Well, I got to tell you, I hope you have 10 bestsellers in the row. You sound fantastic. I have to ask you the last question, and how do I do this delicately, because it involves your age, but how has journalism changed, for better or for worse, since you were in your first job?
Well, I think it's changed for the better in just from the standpoint that we have more choices. Because before, there was basically the 3 networks and so forth. But now we have more choices, and we also have such a tremendous coverage for books, whether it's on Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com, ebooks. All of my books are on Kindle, of course, and anyone, as you mentioned, can go to the website, use a simple name, KarnaBodman.com, or just go to Amazon and put in Bodman, like your bod, B-O-D-M-A-N. And my books will come up. There's so many choices out there. I think it's really terrific that people can just go anywhere on the internet or into a bookstore and have so much to learn.
Well, I'll tell you what.
There.
I'm having a blast. So now I got to go out and get your books and read them because it sounds very, very exciting. Karna, it's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. Great to be with you today. Number 4 is finished, and I'm working on number 5. So hopefully we can keep in touch.
Excellent. We sure will. Karna Small Bodman, everybody.